So the advanced samples processing module that we're going to look at today really actually was kind of designed with genomics cores in mind. And we actually started with Sanger sequencing cores as a model primarily. But at a high level, I think what the sample processing module can do is to be able to accept samples from multiple people in multiple requests and then plate or add all of those samples to a plate or some kind of defined container type that the core might use, like a 96-well plate or an 8-well strip or some kind of a slide or something, and be able to, again, bring all those requests onto the same plate, build their own sample request form that is kind of tied to this plate, and then being able to bill for these samples that have been assigned to this plate all at one time. So bill multiple customers all at one time.
Okay.
So does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that sounds like what they've been talking about in genomics.
Okay, genomics. Is that Deb Grove's core or her former core by any chance, or is that a different one?
No, Craig Pearl is in charge of it.
Okay, very good. Okay, so I'll kind of, just at a high level, I'll kind of show you how we set up this sample processing module for a particular core for a particular application, and then how the customer submits samples to be processed in this module, and then how to assign samples to a plate, how to process that plate, and then bill for charges. So within samples, we have this concept called a processor. And what this processor does is it takes kind of a combination of things and puts it all together. And typically it is, these processors are specific per application. So for example, you might have build a processor for Sanger sequencing, and you might build a second one for qPCR, and maybe a third different one for DNA QC, let's say. And you just build it according to the needs of the particular scientific application or technology that you want to use. So the processor, again, it kind of groups all these things together. The first thing we start with when we're building one of these processors is to define the container type. So again, this container type could be a 96-well plate, 8-strip tube strip. And so we'll just create a new container type quickly so I can show you how it works. So you give it a name, let's say, 8-well strip. And then you define what the dimensions of the container itself will be. So let's say for an 8-well strip, you're going to have 1 column, but you might have 8 rows.
Okay.
And so it's going to look something like this. Any dimension, anything that the core uses to put their customer samples into. So it's pretty simple how to set that up. So they define the container type. The next thing that they're going to do is build the sample form. And this is essentially the request form that the customer is going to fill out. And the core will decide, what fields and information they need to capture in that customer request form. So if we look at one of our existing Sanger sequencing request forms, for example, and again, the core can choose whatever fields they want to have their customers fill out. And they kind of build this form using, there's several different kinds of fields that they can include in the form. So if they want to include, let's say, drop-down fields or text fields or, numerical fields, they can do that. So they can give each of these fields a name, choose the type of field it's going to be. If it's going to be a drop-down field, they populate with all the entries that they want their customers to choose from. And so they build their request form, again, per processor. Maybe not the prettiest of screens, but it's functional. It's one of those things we will come back to and improve. So we build our container type, we build our request form, and then again, we bring it all into what we call this processor. And so I'll open the existing Sanger sequencing processor so you can take a look at what's all included in there. So again, we give the processor a name, which will represent, again, the application or technology they want to use. We'll choose the container type that we want to associate to this processor, so usually 96-well plate for sequencing. The request form that we built for that application. There's some, additional specific fields that I don't think we need to get into for this demo today, but there's the ability to add core-defined control samples or blanks or water that they can assign to a plate. There's the ability to add these analysis protocols or run protocols. And again, specific to the technology or piece of instrumentation that they're using. But where these fields come in handy is what we can do is also build a file from these processors that can be formatted specifically in such a way that they can be imported automatically into instrument software. So typically what we would do is we would get an example file from the instrument software, and then we would construct something that would match that in iLab, and then they would be able to, again, import those plate files right into the software. There's the ability to add some help text to the sample request, project request. Then down here, what they can do is they can choose whether they want to allow their customer to submit samples, so that would be like individual samples in a single tube, or they can decide if they want to allow their customers to submit in, say, full plates. So that would be allow containers here. And then we can assign billing specific to whether it's submitted as a plate, a full plate, let's say, or an individual tube. You can have different pricing for each. And then again, this file template, it's a little bit more advanced functionality, but again, this is where we can build those files that can be imported directly into instrument software. So does that make sense how these processors work, what they're used for, how they're built?
I think so.
Conceptually, okay. Okay, so once we, and again, this is done, it's a one-time only thing. The core sets these processors up, and then they don't really have to do anything to them unless they need to change something or update something in the processor. So again, once the core is built then we build a iLab project request that uses the samples module. So we can go through submitting a Sanger sequencing request, and you can kind of see how these things come together. So customer would submit, let's say, a Sanger sequencing project request. And I'm just going to submit something on behalf of a customer here. And so this is what the form looks like for a sample processing request. It looks pretty similar to the rest of our project requests, but with a few differences. So within this forms and request details, this is where the customer is going to enter in their sample information. This is where they're going to choose if they want to submit, either individual samples or 96-well plates. We set that processor up so that the core, can accept both kinds from customers. If the customer chooses to submit individual samples, then this individual tube charge is going to be applied to each sample in the grid. If the customer wants to submit a full plate of samples, and oftentimes, those full plates will be cheaper for the customer, and so it will have a different plate price. And so then that plate price is updated there. So we'll just submit a couple individual samples as a customer. Okay, and then so let's say the core, again, for Sanger sequencing, they may want to have the customer indicate what primer they want to use to sequence with. So the core can choose, to populate with drop-down menu all the primers that they have available in the core, or the customer can, indicate they have their own customer-provided primer. If the core wants to know the concentration of the samples, they would have put that in their request form. We have that here. Some some other values here maybe they want to fill out. And sorry, this is kind of a test form, so maybe all the fields aren't exactly informative, the names of them. Okay, so again, the customer would fill out the information in this grid. Once they're done, or they can do it via an Excel upload. So if they have, many samples, they can use, an Excel spreadsheet to, quickly fill out a lot of information and then upload it right to this grid here. But once they've added all their samples that they want to submit, they're going to click Confirm Samples. And then 3 samples will be generated with an iLab. And we'll see those here in this subsection here. If the customer wants to edit any information about these samples, they can do that before they submit it to the core. And then you can see those individual tube charges. So for 3 samples, we've added those as chargeable items to the request. They can indicate their payment information, how they want to pay for this work. It's a typical iLab form information here. And I'm just going to skip these approval steps as a core admin so we can get right to work assigning these samples to a plate. So any questions about how this request form works? Again, I think it's basically the same as regular iLab forms, just a few differences specifically to samples.
Are they able to copy and paste into that grid? Like from an Excel?
Yep, sure. They can copy and paste, or they can upload the spreadsheet right to the grid, or they can enter it in by hand. There's a few different ways they could do it. Okay. Okay, so once that sample has been submitted to the core, it's going to show in their view all requests. And the core would typically change the status of this request to processing once they're satisfied, all the information is there. Once a sample's request has been changed to processing, it's going to be available for adding to a plate. So what we do here is now we go to this Samples tab, which is available only to core staff. And then here's where we're going to choose, the appropriate processor for these particular samples. So again, we have our Sanger sequencing processor, and we're going to see all the requests that have been submitted for this particular application to the core. So we have just a couple of old requests in the system that are not usable right now, but here is the request that we just submitted with 3 samples. We can see the individual sample names, the primer. And what we're going to do now is we're going to assign these samples to a plate. So a 96 well plate. So we'll first create a new plate. We'll close that. It gets a system generated plate name, but this name can be modified if the core uses a different plate naming convention.
Can there be a convention set up in settings?
Not currently, no. There's no setting to configure that plate name. Right now it's just system generated, but manually editable.
Okay.
Okay, so save. So then to assign these plates to, or assign these samples to these plates, we can do it a couple of different ways. We can assign one of them at a time by clicking on an individual sample and then just clicking the well in the plate that we want to assign it to. Or we can clear that sample from the plate. We can assign a whole request's worth of samples to a plate. So we do that by choosing them all and then coming down to this section here where we would choose whether we want to auto insert them horizontally or we can insert them vertically. So obviously this is handy when you've got a request with 100 samples on it. You just choose them all, determine the orientation, and then they're automatically placed into the appropriate well. Then we can also insert a core specific sample. So again, like a control or water or blank. Sanger sequencing often uses PGEM as a control. And so again, then if we had multiple requests, 8, 10 customers, whatever, have submitted samples, we go through them request, one request at a time, and then add those to the plate. Once we're done adding all of our samples to the plate that we want to, we can choose, the core can choose if they want to assign it to a particular, staff member to process. Don't have to. They can choose, a defined run protocol or analysis protocol that they've created. Once they've set up those settings there, then they will click finalize, and that actually, creates the plate in the system with all of those samples assigned to it. And then it is not shown in the list anymore, unless we want to show finalized plates, and we can look at all the plates that we've worked on in the past. So at that point, so again, the customer submits their samples, the core reviews them, changes the status of those requests to processing. They become available now for assignment to a plate. The core, defines some additional attributes on that plate. Then they go away, out of iLab, and then they go, do their work at the bench. So they set up those samples, they run them on the instrument, they, complete the work, generate the files. Then they would come back to iLab and finish up that plate and essentially get it ready for billing. So we have this plate that we created here. We can go back and take a look at it from this view here if we need to. See the information. The core can download a printable PDF file to, actually forgot to mention this before they started their work. They could download a PDF file of the plate information itself, so that if they want to take that printout to the bench to work from, they can do that. Also through this interface here, so once the samples have been finished running in the lab, let's say the core needs to rerun some of those samples, or maybe they don't want to charge for some of those samples, they can assign that here. So for example, if they want to rerun one of those samples, they would just change this rerun from no to yes. And that sample is going to show up back up in their queue to assign to another plate down the line. And they can also set here if they don't want to charge for a particular sample. But once they finish processing that plate, they're going to click Finish Processing, and then they will confirm charges. And what this does is it updates all the samples and requests that were on that plate to a status of ready to bill. So they can, they can be invoiced, added to invoices right away. So if we just go back to the core main page. And look at our View All Requests page. You can see here that here's the order that I just placed. It has a status of complete. The core can additionally fully complete the request. I guess where this is handy to complete the sequencing part of the request is there's also the ability to add additional charges to that request. So let's say if they want to do something other than Sanger sequencing on that request, say they want to do some QC, DNA QC, they can add that charge to the request, but they may not want to complete that service in the system until it's actually completed. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we see that that request is, is completed, and these individual sample charges now have a status of ready to bill. And so then, just typical, iLab workflow, add them to a billing event, generate invoices, have your investigators pay. So yeah, so I think, at a kind of at a high to medium level, that's how sample processing module works in iLab.